Good evening, happy Wednesday to everyone. I hope you're doing well, staying safe from the storms that have been blowing through. It reminds me of some of the early churches I served where people would sing till the storm passes by. And we're praying that this storm called COVID-19 passes by even more quickly. Hope you're staying safe and smart, and hope that you're being kind and careful and being not afraid as well. This evening, as we study Nehemiah together, we're going to be talking about pivoting, creating a pivot. You'll be hearing more about how we're planning a pivot here among us as well. But first of all, I just want to say welcome to all my free-range followers of Jesus and saints of Wadesboro as we enter into prayer time tonight. Join me in prayer, will you? Lord, thank you for the rains that bring fruit and grain. Thank you for the gifts of the earth that feed us. Thank you for the refreshment that we feel when the rains have gone through. And we thank you for our church family. Lord, I would ask that we continue to be diligent and purposeful and intentional and making calls to each other, encouraging each other, following up on the cares for each other. This week I want to give you praise and thanksgiving for the good news of returning health for some of our more mature members, as we've had good news come from the hospitals. We give you thanks also for the connection and the excitement people have as we are starting to think about worshiping at our place and not just worshiping in place. As we start to discern and to pray and to plan and ask God that you bless our hearts and minds with your wisdom so that we may work together in concert and with one heart and in unity. Lord, we have been disconnected for a long time, and we know that the enemy often wants to get us separated, wants to get us isolated so that we can be attacked more easily. We'd ask God that during this time that we would search you more diligently with our hearts, and that you would heal the broken places in us, and that you would unite us spiritually in a way that we have maybe never been united together in purpose and vision. Father, teach us tonight through your word. Comfort us in our brokenness. Make sure, God, that you search our hearts and know that we're yours, and that you are the one who is living in us through the power of your Holy Spirit. And we would ask, God, that you bring anything to our mind and heart and our will that is an obstacle to our relationship together. Father, we praise you and we thank you in Jesus' name. Well, welcome back to Nehemiah. This evening, we're going to be talking about Nehemiah's pivot that takes place in chapter 4. Last week when we visited Nehemiah, he had presented his plan. He had presented the buy-in from the influencers. He had cast his vision. And they began the work on the wall. And we saw how people began to work. And part of that plan was, to use my grandma's old phrase, was to sweep it around their own front door first, as they began to look and to rebuild that wall. We saw how they worked shoulder to shoulder, and that they were fired up by the vision, and they were very, very excited about it. And that's one of those things that as we are looking at tonight's lesson in chapter 4, I want us to be prepared, because there will be a continuing theme that we've looked at ever since Nehemiah arrived on the scene. And that's the opposition that Sanballat and Tobiah, who were the primary influential commercial and governmental leaders in that area, prior to Nehemiah coming, they don't want success to happen. And one of the things we're going to be looking at is that whenever we have a vision from God, whether that's individually or corporately as a congregation, whenever we get together and we seek God's heart, and we seek God's wisdom, and we seek God's purpose, we can expect opposition from the enemy. In fact, that's one of those things that I've heard some of my more mature members say, if you're coasting in life, it may mean that you're going downhill. So if there's not some resistance, if there's not some opposition, it may mean that we're not really leaning into God's purposes for what He's wanting to do in kingdom work right around us. Nehemiah was really, really about kingdom work. He was wanting to purposefully rebuild the wall, and we revisited a few weeks ago the why of that. That it was a disgrace that the wall was broken down because it was a symbol of God's protection and presence around God's presence in the temple. Sanballat and Tobiah did not want to lose the influence of their power. Now, I've seen that operative not only in governmental levels, I've seen that not only in the business world that I've lived in, I've seen that in the church too, where people have built their own little fiefdoms or kingdoms in committees or in sometimes pulpits, the pastors themselves. And any threat to their power brings about ridicule, or in this world, if you're under 40, you'll understand the term gaslighting. It's manipulating or somehow getting somebody to get spun up because of our manipulation, gaslighting people, just so that we can make and provoke some kind of response that gets them off track. Well, Sanballat and Tobiah were, it seems, masters at gaslighting the Jews because they would become discouraged. And they had been successful using ridicule and mockery to discourage and distract the Jews from their work. But Nehemiah had come and cast a new vision. Nehemiah had come and he was giving them the direct vision of God, and it also showed them the successes that God had given him. And with a clear plan and a clear call and a clear path, they began to build the wall. In chapter 4, the opposition intensifies, the distraction, the detractors. And every time that this is lifted up again, look at how Nehemiah responds to the opposition. Whether it's in your workplace, in your church place, whether it's in your own family, Nehemiah has a very direct approach that we will see also modeled in the life of Jesus later in the New Testament. So Sanballat heard that they were rebuilding the wall, and he became angry. Now, we've heard this before. And he became greatly incensed. And I want us to take that notion of greatly incensed, and I want us to think about something. The Hebrew here is a very interesting sentence construct. Angry and greatly incensed. He was, in our terms, he was livid. Have you ever been so angry that you just gritted your teeth and you shook and your mind gets cloudy and all you want to do is lash out and you want to destroy, you want to hurt somebody because you're so angry? Well, that's the picture of Sanballat. He's not just upset. He is absolutely shaken to the core with his anger. One of the other places that we saw this same kind of construct is over in Exodus when Pharaoh got angry and his heart hardened. In other words, he was not going to, come hell or high water, give in to Moses and his crew. And that same kind of mindset had now set in to Sanballat. It didn't matter what reason, it didn't matter what recourse, it didn't matter what resources, or even the logic, or even the backing of the Persian king was going to satisfy Sanballat. He was dead set against what was going on in Jerusalem and rebuilding. He was livid. And you might say his heart was hardened. He was not going to be open to any kind of change. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and in the presence of the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews?" Now here he's gone from just questioning the plan to mockery. The feeble Jews. Not just the Jews, but the feeble Jews. You can tell what's in a person's heart when they begin to place labels on people and to mock them and to ridicule them. Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish it in a day? Can they bring these stones back to life from these heaps of rubble, burned as they are? In other words, layer after layer after layer of you cannot do it. You cannot do it. I was recently talking to a young man who grew up in a family that had been very rigidly religious. They were there every time the church opened. But the father of this young man had over and over and over, most of this young man's life had been like Sanballat in his life. You feeble young man, you always mess up. Why can't you do this right? How do you expect to do anything if you don't study, if you don't run right, if you don't do this? And he grew up with nothing but condemnation and ridicule most of his life. When he turned to drugs in his 20s, he only got more condemnation. It wasn't until he began to hear words of life and vision about what God can do that he began to sense that there was another reality at work. And here's the very, very first thing that Nehemiah teaches us about opposition, the enemies in our life, the detractors, the distractors, the people who don't want us to succeed, who want to gaslight us, who want to confuse us, who want to label us, who want to mock us, who want to ridicule us. Here's the first lesson. In verse 4 of chapter 4, Nehemiah prays for his enemy. Now I want us to be honest about this, because before I read the prayer, I want you to think about what kind of prayer, before reading it, before reading what that prayer is, what kind of prayer would that be? Praying for your enemy. Many of us are still unsure about what God's heart is like. And I spent a lot of time over the years trying to help people understand the difference between their childhood and childlike view of God as a critical parent, or the great-grandfather who gives you everything, and the God who is living and purposeful, who loves us enough sometimes to discipline us, but loves us enough to hear and accept and meet us where we are in our humanity. And that's going to be an important part of the concept of when Jesus comes. And I'm going to be preaching some about that on Sunday. But at this moment, in this prayer that Nehemiah is going to pray, it may surprise you. He's praying for his enemy. But it's not the, "Oh Lord, forgive them" prayer. When you look at this prayer, you can hear the Psalms. You can hear many times in the Psalms. It's called an imprecatory prayer. And what I mean, and what that word means is, God, I'm going to give you the final say for revenge, justice. But here's what I would really like to happen to him. You ever felt that way? Lord, I want to trust you with the outcome of this person who is just absolutely making my life miserable. But if you really want my opinion, this is what I think ought to happen to him. And a lot of us want to take revenge. We want to take getting even. We want to take punishment into our own hands. But listen to the prayer of Nehemiah. Hear us, our God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders. In other words, Lord, punish them. And while we may be uncomfortable with those kinds of prayers, aren't they real? Aren't they really part of us when we're suffering an injustice from somebody? But here's the piece of it that's so important. He's praying for God to do something and not taking it into his own hands, which is what most of us want to do. What most of us are tempted to do. And if we're honest, what most of us try to do. I'm going to get even. They hurt me, I'm going to hurt them back. They abuse me, I'm going to abuse them back. Nehemiah walked in the Psalms, apparently. He was steeped in the faith of David and Moses. He understood that it's an intimate relationship. And in a healthy, intimate relationship, we are free to express our anger without sin. When we are in a healthy relationship and understand God as one who loves us, we start to get a hint of who Jesus is and would become as our high priest. The book of Hebrews puts it this way: we have a priest who is like us in every way, but has not sinned. We have one who intercedes for us, who knows of what we're made. Jesus experienced that humanity in order to be able to represent us. And it's freeing for me to know that when I read Psalms and I even read this prayer for the enemy that's not a please forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. It's freeing for me to be able to say, God, thank you for allowing me to express my deepest, rawest emotion to you, and you are not judging me based on that. But in fact, I'm leaving and trusting and believing that you are just and that you will handle all of that on my behalf. So what was the result of that? When Sanballat's gaslighting and now Nehemiah prays, guess what he does? The very next sentence. So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height. For the people worked with all their heart. Isn't it sometimes just a relief to get it off your chest? The very next thing after the prayer and the leadership of Nehemiah's prayer with his people and his say, God, you got to deal with this because we can't. That is a wonderful step of faith to come before God and say, God, you got to deal with these people. You've got to fight this battle for me because I can't. I can't change my husband's mind. I can't change my wife's heart. I can't change my boss's attitude. I can't undo this stuff that's been done to me. God, I cry out to you. You do it. You fight this battle for me. I'm going to leave it in your hands because I got a wall to build. You see, Nehemiah didn't let their detraction or his anger or his hurt detract him from the mission. Right now, we're in a time where all of our churches are hurting, where all of our churches are uncertain what it looks like to be on the other side of COVID. And there are people who are saying, "Well, what does the church really do anyway? What's the church about? What does the community really miss the church at this point? If the church is just at the end of this close the doors and say, well, we just can't afford to be open, we can't continue to go forward," and there are those out there saying, "Well, good riddance." There are some who detract and decry the church's presence. What if we're saying, God, we know that there's an uncertainty out there, but we want to live in that purpose. We want to live in that vision just like Nehemiah was given. We want to live in the fresh vision that you want to pour out to us as a people of God. No matter which building we gather in, we want to be your people that are called by your name under the lordship of Jesus Christ, under the sovereignty of the living God. And we want you to fight those battles for us, Lord. And at the same time, we're going to respond by working with all of our heart. You hear that? It's a renewed sense of vigor that even with the detraction, even with the sense of desperation, a renewed vision and just getting stuff off our chest that maybe had been laying there for a long time, saying, God, you're going to deal with all that negativity. They got it up to half its height, and they were working with all their heart. And you know what the effect that all that had on Sanballat? It made them madder. It made them even more angry. To the point that they plotted together to raise an army to come and take Jerusalem and to fight against Jerusalem. And so what was their response? What was Jerusalem's response? Nehemiah's response? You find it in verse 9. We prayed to our God and we posted a guard. We prayed and we practiced our faith. We prayed and we did the practical. For some of us, we think of prayer as going back to the image of God as a great granddaddy or something. That we just need to sit in a corner and pray for him to give us something. Now more than ever, and at least in my lifetime, it's a time for prayer and work to come together. Prayer and preparation for what it looks like to worship out of COVID. To pray and prepare for what it means to be in ministry as God's people when we come back together. To pray and work together so that we are not distracted by what used to be, but are more pulled into the future of what can be as God unites us to a new vision and to a new sense of community. We cannot go backwards, my friends. God's pulling us, through the words of Nehemiah, to a newness of life. They had been so beaten down that for 200 years, as I've said before, that wall had been just laying in ruins. But now, even in the midst of opposition, even with the threat of power, physical conflict, they got busy and they prayed and worked shoulder to shoulder, and they prepared and they posted a guard. You see, they knew something about how to pivot. Sometimes we make our plans, and the Proverbs tell us this. We make our plans, but God has a different plan. In this thing, I want us to just end on this note tonight. As we're praying and planning for a reopen, as what I'm starting to call come worship at our place instead of worship in place. As we're preparing that, I want you to think of this. No matter what we have been in the past, just like Nehemiah, the Jews in Jerusalem, the plan that God gave Nehemiah in Persia, that he came and assessed when he arrived, that he presented to the elders and to the people of Jerusalem, that they began to work on that plan and effectuate that plan, and they worked shoulder to shoulder, start building. The opposition and the new circumstances that emerged because they were building that wall and the new opposition that it brought made them pivot. Now, what does that mean? When we look at verses 15 and following, Nehemiah didn't just stick to the original plan, but was able to assess again the nuances of the new reality, and they pivoted. So now, instead of just everybody working outside their own door and everybody working shoulder to shoulder on their piece of the wall, some people were posted as guards. Some people were posted as laborers. Some people were posted as sentries. Some people stood in the gaps of the walls while other people labored. And everybody carried their own weapon, even as they labored. You see, there are circumstances, even like now, right now, where we may have had plans and documents and all kinds of things that brought us and fed us for many years or carried us through normal times. But the circumstances caused Nehemiah and his team to pivot. And if we're not able to pivot, we may get overwhelmed by the opposition itself. My prayer for you, that in your life right now, no matter what circumstance you are in, what opposition you may find yourself in, two things. You have the gift of prayer to a loving God who can hear the rawest emotion that you have. And two, he has a plan that may even be for you to pivot right now into a whole other direction. My prayer is that you hear that gift and that you really reflect on that this week. We'll see you next week, but I'll see you Sunday. God bless you.